Hi everyone, I'm going to be doing a quick lecture on the hybrid project management methodology. So let's get to it. Uh, First things first, I'm going to be talking about the waterfall and the agile project management methodology first, and then move on to the hybrid project management. It will make sense in a minute why I'm doing it in that order. After that, I'm also going to be talking about how to apply the hybrid project management methodology to your projects. And then at the end, I'm going to give an example of what a hybrid project management framework looks like. In order to understand what a hybrid project management methodology is, we first need to know what waterfall and agile methodologies are. And the reason for that is waterfall and agile methodologies, they both mix together to make up the hybrid project management. And that's why the hybrid project management methodology is sort of like a best of both worlds kind of method. So a waterfall methodology is a traditional approach, and it's also known as a linear methodology. And the reason for that is because the linear methodology is a sequential and heavily requirements focused. This means that the scope of the project has to be well understood, and there's absolutely no place for correction once the project has started. And the reason for that is because the cost of redoing any work will be quite high. The waterfall method is divided into discrete stages, and it starts by collecting and analyzing requirements, and then designing the solutions as well as implementing and fixing issues, if any. And each stage has a start to finish dependency. With any methodology, it has its advantages and disadvantages. The first advantage of using this method is that it's easy to understand and to use. It also has a clear structure, and that comes from the fact that it's quite a rigid method, and it's actually in most cases leads to a often better produced result. The model is also heavily reliant on documentations, and therefore making it easier to bring in new resources and allocate them correctly when needed. It also helps you to determine to determine the goal of the project early on. And that comes from the fact that it's got quite a clear structure, a step-by-step process, and the fact that it heavily relies on documenting each of these steps. When it comes to the disadvantages, the first one would be the fact that it's a rigid method, and what it means is that if there are any errors that are made and any changes required because of these errors, then the project has to begin from the start, and therefore it increases the risk of project failure. It also often excludes the client and the end users from the process of creating the product, and that's because the fact that the testing of the product comes at the very last step, and that is the step that the client and the end users are most involved in. There are also delays in testing, and that's because the testing process, as I mentioned before, comes at the very last step of the product completion. And if you were to visually represent a waterfall methodology, as you can see here, this is what it will look like. So hence, that's where it gets the name of the waterfall methodology from. Moving on to the Agile methodology, as its name suggests, it favors a fast and flexible approach. In contrast to the waterfall methodology, this model it happens in small incremental changes that respond to the changing requirements. So what does that mean is that the project happens in small sprints, which is the same as doing it in small sections. And that will then allow you to get feedback from the stakeholders, from the users, step by step, and make any changes to each stage if need be. So the first advantage of doing this is that the fact it's quite flexible, and since there are no fixed stages, it gives more freedom to make incremental changes. You also get regular feedback from the stakeholders and the clients as well. And that's because the project is delivered in stages, and it gives you a chance to gain regular feedback from stakeholders and make changes accordingly. And therefore, unlike the waterfall method, there is a lower risk of project failure since stakeholders are involved at every step. And because of that involvement, it also encourages frequent communication with all the team members involved. And as a result, it helps to have less rework done on the projects. As with any methodologies, this one is not without its faults. It does have its own disadvantages, and the first one is that there are no fixed plan. So it is quite hard to visualize what the product is going to be looking like, what the processes is going to be, and that can make things a little bit difficult, and it won't sit quite well with the stakeholders if they can't visualize a plan or a timeline. And the other one is the fact that it's collaboration heavy. So it means that you really need to get all the teams, all the members really involved and continuously work with them. And that can cause problems if there is a certain team member that's not available at all times, or there's a stakeholder that is not available, or there are like some clashing of opinions and stuff like that. It can make the process to go a little bit longer than it needs to be, and making things a little bit difficult. And since there are no fixed plans, there are no fixed timelines or anything like that, the end result of what you get is less predictable. You could be starting with an idea of one thing and actually end up with a completely different thing. And depending on the way you look at it, that could be both a good thing and a bad thing as well. So this methodology is best suited to software industries where a lot of rework, a lot of recoding and things like that is required. And the fact that the project of this, the scope of the project is less understood in that industry, that's why it's best suited for that. So if you were to visually represent the Agile methodology, as you can see here, it's a continuous circle. So you start by scanning trends and risks, and then you go to analyze them and make a decision and come up with some solutions. Once you've done that, then you can use the solutions to respond to any opportunities or any risks that may occur. And then lastly, you can make your changes to better the project, better the product at the end, and then that whole process continues. So at each stage, you are continuously scanning, analyzing, responding, and changing till you get to the final stage, which is the completion stage. So finally, what is a hybrid methodology? The hybrid methodology is a combination of waterfall and agile methodologies, and it takes the best of both models and combines them in a flexible yet structured approach that can be used across different projects. The methodology focuses on gathering and analyzing requirements initially, and from there on, it takes the flexibility of the agile approach with an emphasis on the rapid iterations. So breaking all of this information down, let's go back to the Agile methodology. So Agile was created for the software industry, as I mentioned before. And the problem in the software industry was that it was taking a very long time to build an application. They would do this whole long requirement phase, and then they would take a long time to build it. it was very rigid and the changes were hard to make after the requirement phase was locked in. So I believe it was in early 2000s, quite possibly 2001, that the Agile Manifesto was created. So now instead of taking 3 years, you could do a 2-week sprint. And that just means that you can achieve and deliver the software in 2 weeks rather than the 3 years. Agile is better because it's based on flexibility, not necessarily worrying about the tool, but being flexible and adaptable to change. As I previously mentioned, one of the downsides of Agile methodology is that it's not designed to handle dependencies or the strict deadlines that need to be met. So Agile is good for some people, and then other people prefer the more traditional method, depending on the project, depending on the organization, and that's where the waterfall method comes in. So what do we see for people that are kind of in the middle? There has to be room for a blended approach, which is the interesting thing that we've been seeing lately. Almost 80% of companies seem to be implementing some sort of a blended approach in how they run their projects. So what does that mean? It means that maybe their team has a software component to a project and they want to do some sort of an agile process with it. But maybe the overall project, they need to have some sort of a timeline because there is an order that things need to be done in. Maybe there's a research phase, maybe there's a marketing component that needs to be done, or there's training that needs to be done. There are all these things that play together, and that's where being able to incorporate these traditional methods come into play. Because a lot of things do need to have this timeline, do need to have the dependencies. You could be working with multiple teams, and these all need to come together and be orchestrated. And without a good traditional plan, or at least some element of it, you're setting yourself up for a lot of confusion. So basically, with a hybrid or a blended approach, sprints work great for that sort of small burst of efficiencies, but then you've got your scheduling on top of that, that will really keep you headed in the right direction, and you are on a right path and you don't get lost. It helps with the communication overall, kind of knowing where you're headed, because that's what people ask all the time. What's going on? What's coming up next in a project? And at least with the hybrid method, you've got some sort of an idea of where you're starting, what timeline do you have, and where you headed. And as you can see in the diagram on the left-hand side, so you start with your planning as a waterfall feature, which kind of sets you on the right path that you need to be on in order to get to your final product. But in the process of getting to that final product, you will deliver it in tiny, small stages or sprints, get feedback on it, and then if any changes need to happen, you can do that easily with less costs. So in other words, the hybrid project management refers to methods that combine planning strategies from traditional project management environment with the Agile methodology's flexible approach. So when, why, how to use the hybrid methodology. When it comes to the when, you would use it in product development stage. So that is your life cycle phases. And you can also use it in complex end-tier applications. So for example, you've got a graphical user interface, and you could develop that with an Agile or a Scrum method. And then the background technology, which would need to be a little bit more robust and a little bit more stable, and that could be developed with the waterfall model. And that's just as an example. Okay, and with the how, and these are some of the tips that you could use. what is recommended is that you plan with the waterfall and then develop with the agile. And you could also implement new types of communication channels in a proper collaborative solution to support information exchanges and traceability. So that's pretty important. And I'll go through how you can do that a little bit later on. And you can also define standard compliance expectations and focus on them in the design planning phase. So that's kind of results in a more collaborative environment with the client. And when it comes to why you would use this hybrid methodology, it helps you to shorten the design and analysis and planning phase, be compliance with the standards, and results in more collaborations than waterfall. So with the processes and outputs that comes under collaborations and information exchange. So as you can see on the left-hand side, you've got your life cycle phases. So that goes through the concept, initiation, planning, executing, and closing. And each of these phases has its own processes that you need to follow. So for example, in the concept phase, which is where you are coming up with your ideas, you need to start with your stakeholder engagement. That's pretty important to get their sort of like feedback and idea of what they want the final product to look like. Once you've done that, you also need to get a project approval process. So once your idea is set, then you need to get approval for it. And you also need to identify the benefits of the project as well. So that's really important for organizations that are not for profit. If you're starting a project, you need to think about the benefits that it will have for the community. If there are no benefits, then what's the point of doing this project? It will just be a waste of time and money. So that's why identifying the benefits is really, really important for nonprofit organizations. So once you've identified the processes that match that life cycle phase, then you obviously need to think about what outputs you get from those processes. So for example, in the concept phase, once you've gone through your engagement, your approval, and the benefit strategy, you will then need to produce project concept proposal. And you also need to do your concept phase checklist. So going through making sure that every single item is ticked off in your little checklist, and that could be stored for documentation and going back to it, especially when it comes to the lessons learned part of the project. And that just continues on for the initiation, planning, executing, and closing. I have included a proper PDF copy of this on the Google Drive as well. If you want to have a look at that, you can see it a little bit better than possibly on this screen. With the processes, not only you have to think about the life cycle, but you also have to think about the key features and attributes in a project as well. So you also need to think about your scope, your budget, the progress, the risk, the benefits, and the organizational change as well, and what processes are involved in this scope. So when it comes to the scope, for example, there needs to be a formal communication with the stakeholders to identify the scope. So that needs to be your step number one of what you need to do. If you don't know the scope, if you don't talk to the project stakeholders, then there is no way your end product is going to be what they're after. So once you've done that, once you've talked and identified the scope, then you can move on to producing a project concept proposal. And then after that, then you move on to your checklist and making sure that you take bits and pieces of your proposal and make them into a checklist to make sure that you've done them. and and this is what this screen is talking about. So giving you like a step-by-step of what needs to happen for each of these attributes. So again, for example, with the budget, you start by coordinating between the corporate stakeholders to prepare a project budget. So you will have a chat with them, which would be the executive team, the accountants, and the sponsors, to get an estimate of how much they're willing to put for this particular project and what your budget will be. And then once you've done that, then you start by placing all these numbers and figures into an accounting software, and then as an example you can use Vista for that, and it just keeps following on for each of these attributes. So it's a step-by-step of what needs to happen first, followed by what, and ending in what process. This, again, I've included a PDF of this page as well on Google Drive for you to have a look at. And this is about the team formation and development at each of the phases. So that's basically who is involved at each phase. I've also included some softwares that you can use to help you track your project and the progress that you're making. Obviously, the most popular and the most obvious one is MS Project. And it's a really handy software to have. I think it works best, obviously, on it. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work that well on iOS. So that's like your MacBooks and stuff like that. But if you do have a Microsoft project, if you can get it on your laptop or anything like that, it is very useful and quite easy to use. If you've never used it before, I suggest that you look up some tutorials on YouTube perhaps on how to use this and familiarize yourself with it. It will come in very handy. Okay, so this is the hybrid framework that my team and I created for a university project. So basically what this framework allows you to do is to really pick your project apart and figure out every single detail about it, and then come up with your own framework that works really best with your project. So it is a hybrid framework, but in a sense, it also lets you to choose your own framework as well. So, so you won't be locked into a certain thing and try and maneuver your project around the framework that you use. So you use this to figure out what framework works best for your project, if that makes sense. I will also include a copy of this on the Google Drive if you want to have a look at that for later on as well, if you find it useful. So you start off with a template that is modeled off the key project lifecycle phases. So every single project has a concept, initiation phase as well, and then obviously you've got your executing and closing too. So once you've identified your life cycle phases, you then start to look at what your project looks like in terms of your key features. So that was the scope, budget, team size, and stuff that we went over previously. So when you're looking at your scope, you've got three options for your scope: modular, variable, or rigid. So you need to figure out where your scope lies within these three defining categories. And then you look at your budget. Do you have a flexible budget? Is your budget variable, or is it like a fixed amount? And then you look at your team size. Do you have a small team that you're working with? Less than 50? And then the medium is like 50 to 100, and then large is 100 plus. So you need to figure out what kind of team you've got, what kind of budget you've got, what kind of scope you've got. And then once you've done that, then you can start to plan what type of framework would suit your project best. And then, as I said here, use these attributes to build your framework from the corresponding toolboxes. And by toolboxes, I mean these. So we've created a toolbox for each attribute as well. So you've got one for scope, you've got one for budget, you've got one for team size, and all of that. So previously here, as an example, we said that our scope is modular. So we come and look at the modular section. The first item we've got there is daily stand-up meetings. So we take that daily stand-up meetings and then we'll figure out which life cycle phase would this attribute best fit in. So when it comes to meetings, that would be your initiation phase. That's when your idea was created, and now you're going to have meetings with stakeholders, with the different teams to start putting a plan together. And then you move on to your budget. So your budget, as an example, we said was flexible. And then you select one of these options. And as an example, we said outline known and unknown budgets. So where would outlining the known and unknown in the project fit? That would be in the concept phase. That's when you kind of have an idea of what you're doing, but not really. That's where the known and unknown comes in. And then you repeat this process for every single life cycle phase. So again, for team size, we said that we've got a large team, and that would be designating subgroups within the team. And when it comes to designating subgroups, that would be in the initiation phase, where you assigning each part of the project to each group. As you might have noticed, that each box has been color-coded, and that matches, as you can see in the legend, to the scope, the budget, the team size, the procedures, and the durations. So you can kind of like figure out where these sort of like toolboxes have come from. And once you've got that, then you start writing them down. So with your scope, you can start saying which kind of framework would suit that best. And once you've done that, this hybrid approach allows you to develop a fully unique and adaptable framework at any given for any given project. I hope that has made sense for you and can kind of like helped you understand what a hybrid framework is. And I will also include this hybrid approach in the Google Drive, as I said earlier, for you to have a look and see. We got the idea from a research paper, so I will also include that research paper in if you're interested in having a read of that as well. Thank you so much, everyone.